It's a definite benefit for so many to recognize that our $40 billion annual investment in intelligence gathering prior to 9/11 was a failure. Now a sincere desire exists to rectify these mistakes. That's good, unless instead of changing the role of the CIA and the FBI, all the past mistakes are made worse by spending more money and enlarging the bureaucracy to do the very same thing without improvement in their efficiency or change in their goals. Unfortunately, that is what is likely to happen. One of the major shortcomings that led to the 9/11 tragedies was the responsibility for protecting commercial airlines was left to the government, the FAA, the FBI, the CIA, and INS. And they failed. A greater sense of responsibility for the owners to provide security is what's needed. Guns in the cockpit would have most likely prevented most of the deaths that occurred on that fateful day. But what does our government do? It firmly denies airline pilots the right to defend their planes, and we federalize the security screeners and rely on F-16s to shoot down airliners if they are hijacked. Security screeners, many barely able to speak English, spend endless hours harassing pilots, confiscating dangerous mustache scissors, mauling grandmothers and children, and pestering Al Gore, while doing nothing about the influx of aliens from Middle Eastern countries who are on designated watch lists. We pump up the military in India and Pakistan, ignore all the warnings about Saudi Arabia, and plan a secret war against Iraq to make sure no one starts asking, where's Osama bin Laden? We think we know where Saddam Hussein lives, so let's go get him instead. Since our government bureaucracy failed, why not get rid of it instead of adding to it? If we had proper respect and understood how private property owners effectively defend themselves, we could apply those rules to the airlines and achieve something worthwhile. If our immigration policies have failed, when will we defy the politically correct fanatics and curtail the immigration of those individuals on the highly suspect list? Instead of these changes, all we hear is that the major solution will come by establishing a huge new federal department, the Department of Homeland Security. According to all the pundits, we are expected to champion the big government approach, and if we don't jolly well like it, we will be tagged unpatriotic. The fear that permeates our country cries out for something to be done in response to almost daily warnings of the next attack. If it's not a real attack, then it's a theoretical one where the bomb could well be only in the minds of a potential terrorist. Where is all this leading us? Are we moving toward a safer and more secure society? I think not. All the discussions of these proposed plans since 9/11 have been designed to condition the American people to accept major changes in our political system. Some of the changes being made are unnecessary, and others are outright dangerous to our way of life. There is no need for us to be forced to choose between security and freedom. Giving up freedom does not provide greater security. Preserving and better understanding freedom can. Sadly, today, many are anxious to give up freedom in response to real and generated fears. The plans for a first strike supposedly against a potential foreign government should alarm all Americans. If we do not resist this power the president is assuming, our president, through executive order, can start a war any place, anytime, against anyone he chooses for any reason without congressional approval. This is a tragic usurpation of the war power by the executive branch from the legislative branch, with Congress being all too accommodating. Removing the power of the executive branch to wage war, as was done through our revolution and the writing of the Constitution, is now being casually sacrificed on the altar of security. In a free society, and certainly in the constitutional republic we have been given, it should never be assumed that the president alone can take it upon himself to wage war whenever he pleases. The publicly announced plan to murder Saddam Hussein in the name of our national security law draws nary a whimper from Congress. Support is overwhelming, without a thought as to the legality, the morality, the constitutionality, or its practicality. Murdering Saddam Hussein will surely generate many more fanatics ready to commit their lives to suicide attacks against us. Our CIA attempts to assassinate Castro backfired when the subsequent assassination, with the subsequent assassination of our president. Killing Saddam Hussein just for the sake of killing him obviously will increase the threat against us, not diminish us. It makes no sense. But our warriors argue that someday he may build a bomb, someday he might use it, maybe against us or some unknown target. This policy further radicalizes the Islamic fundamentalists against us because from their viewpoint, Our policy is driven by Israel, not U.S. security interests. Planned assassination, a preemptive strike policy without proof of any threat, and a vague definition of terrorism may work for us as long as we're king of the hill. But one must assume every other nation will naturally use our definition of policy as justification for dealing with their neighbors. India can justify a first strike against Pakistan, China against India or Taiwan, as well as many other examples. This new policy, if carried through, will make the world a lot less safe. This new doctrine is based on proving a negative, which is something impossible to do, especially when we're dealing with a subjective interpretation of plans buried in someone's head. To those who suggest a more restrained approach on Iraq and killing Saddam Hussein, the war hawks retort, saying, "Prove to me that Saddam Hussein might not do something someday directly harmful to the United States." Since no one can prove this, the warmongers shout, "Let's march to Baghdad." We can all agree that aggression should be met with force and that providing national security is an ominous responsibility that falls on the shoulders of Congress. But avoiding useless and unjustifiable wars that threaten our whole system of government and security seems to be the more prudent thing to do. Since September 11th, Congress has responded with a massive barrage of legislation not seen since Roosevelt took over in 1933. Where Roosevelt dealt with trying to provide economic security, today's legislation deals with personal security from any and all imaginable threat at any cost, dollar or freedom-wise. These include the Patriot Act, which undermines the Fourth Amendment with the establishment of an overly broad and dangerous definition of terrorism. The Financial Anti-Terrorism Act, which expands the government's surveillance of the financial transactions of all Americans, citizens through the increased power of FinCEN, and puts back on track the plans to impose know-your-customer regulations on all Americans. The airline bailout bill gave $15 billion rushed through shortly after 9/11. The federalization of all airline security employees, military tribunals set up by executive orders, undermining the rights of those accused, rights established as far back as 1215. Unlimited retention of suspects without charges being made, even when a crime has not been committed, a serious precedent that one day may well be abused. Relaxation of FBI surveillance guidelines of all political activity. Functioning of the federal government authority and essentially monopolizing vaccines and treatment for infectious diseases, permitting massive quarantines and mandates for vaccinations. Almost all significant legislation since 9/11 has been rushed through in a tone of urgency that, with reference to the tragedy, including the $190 billion farm bill. Guarantees to all insurance companies are now moving quickly through the Congress. Increasing the billions already flowing into foreign aid is now being planned as our interventions overseas continue to grow and expand. There's no reason to believe that the massive increase in spending, both domestic and foreign, along with the massive expansion of the size of the federal government, will slow anytime soon. The deficit is exploding as the economy weakens. When the government sector drains the resources needed for capital expansion, it contributes to the loss of confidence needed for growth and allowing the economy to function. Even without evidence that any good has come from this massive expansion of government power, Congress is in the process of establishing this huge new Department of Homeland Security, hoping miraculously through centralization to make all these efforts productive and worthwhile. There's no evidence, however, that government bureaucracy and huge funding can solve our nation's problem. The likelihood is that the unintended consequences of this new proposal will be to diminish our freedoms and do nothing to enhance our security. Opposing currently proposed legislation, recently passed legislation, does not mean that one is complacent about terrorism or homeland security. The truth is that there are alternative solutions to these problems we face without restoring to expanding the size and scope of government at the expense of liberty. As tempting as it may seem, a government is incapable of preventing crimes. On occasion, with luck, they might succeed. But the failure to tip us off about 9/11 after spending $40 billion a year on intelligence gathering should have surprised no one. Governments, by nature, are very inefficient institutions. We must accept that as fact. I'm sure that our intelligence agency had the information available to head off 9/11, but bureaucratic blundering and turf wars prevented the information from being useful. But the basic principle is wrong. City policemen can't and should not be expected to try to prevent crimes. This would invite massive intrusions into the everyday activities of every law-abiding citizen. But that's exactly what our recent legislation is doing. It's a wrong-headed approach, no matter how wonderful it may sound. The policemen in the inner cities patrol their beats, but crime is still rampant. In the rural areas of America, literally millions of citizens are safe and secure in their homes, though miles from any police protection. They are safe because even the advantage of isolation doesn't entice the burglar to rob a house when he knows a shotgun sits inside the door waiting to be used. But this is a right denied many of our citizens living in the inner city. The whole idea of government preventing crime is dangerous. To prevent crimes in our homes or businesses, governments would need cameras to spy on every move to check for illegal drug use, wife-beating, child abuse, or tax evasion. They would need cameras not only on our streets and in our homes, but on our phones. Our phones, internet, and travels would need to be constantly monitored just to make sure we're not a terrorist, drug dealer, or tax evader. This is the assumption now used at the airports. Rather than allowing privately owned airlines to profile their passengers to assure the safety for which the airline owners ought to assume responsibility. But of course, this would mean guns in the cockpit. I am certain that this approach to safety and security would be far superior to the rules that existed prior to 9/11 and now have been made much worse in the past 9 months. This method of providing security emphasizes private property ownership and responsibility of the owners to protect that property. But the right to bear arms must be included. The fact that the administration is opposed to guns in the cockpit and the fact that the airline owners are more interested in bailouts and insurance protection means they were just digging a bigger hole for ourselves, ignoring liberty and expanding the government to provide something it's not capable of doing. Because of this, in combination with a foreign policy that generates more hatred toward us and multiplies the number of terrorists that seek vengeance, I am deeply concerned that Washington's efforts so far sadly have only made us more vulnerable. I'm convinced that the newly proposed Department of Homeland Security will do nothing to make us more secure, but it will make us a lot poorer and less free. If the trend continues, the Department of Homeland Security may well be the vehicle used for a much more ruthless control of the people by some future administration than any of us dreams. Let's pray that this concern will never materialize. America is not now a ruthless authoritarian police state, but our concerns ought to be whether we have laid the foundation of a more docile police state. The love of liberty has been so diminished that we tolerate intrusions into our privacy today that would have been abhorred just a few years ago. Tolerance of inconvenience to our liberties is not uncommon when both personal and economic fears persist. The sacrifices being made to our liberties will surely usher in a system of government that will please only those who enjoy being in charge of running other people's lives. What then is the answer? Is America a police state? My answer is maybe, not yet, but it's fast approaching. The seeds have been sown, and many of our basic protections against tyranny have been and are constantly being undermined. The post-9/11 atmosphere here in Congress has provided ample excuse to concentrate on safety at the expense of liberty, failing to recognize that we cannot have one without the other. When the government keeps detailed records on every move we make and we either need advance permission for everything we do or are penalized for not knowing what the rules are, America will be a declared police state. Personal privacy for law-abiding citizens will be a thing of the past. Enforcement of laws against economic and political crimes will exceed that of violent crimes. War will be the prerogative of the administration. Civil liberties will be suspended for suspects, and their prosecution will not be carried out by an independent judiciary. In a police state, this becomes common practice rather than a rare incident. Some argue that we already live in a police state, and Congress doesn't have the foggiest notion of what we're dealing with. So forget it and use your energies for your own survival, some advise. And they advise also that the momentum toward the monolithic state cannot be reversed. Possibly that's true, but I'm optimistic that if we do the right thing and do not capitulate to popular fallacies and fancies, that the incessant war propaganda and the excessive war propaganda, the onslaught of statism can be reversed. To do so, we as a people once again have to dedicate ourselves to establishing the proper role as a government plays in a free society. That does not involve the redistribution of wealth through force. It does not mean that government dictates to us the moral and religious standards of the people. It does not allow us to force the world to police the world by involving ourselves in every conflict as if it's our responsibility to manage a American world empire. But it does mean government has a proper role in guaranteeing free markets, protecting voluntary and religious choices, and guaranteeing private property ownership while punishing those who violate these rules, whether foreign or domestic. In a free society, the government's job is simply to protect liberty, The people do the rest. Let's not give up on a grand experiment that provided so much for so many. Let's reject the police state. I yield back.